Well, it looks like people enjoyed my last video adapting the Lethal Company play model into a realistic style, and I gotta thank you guys for the support on that one. I wasn't expecting as much of a reception as there was, so we're doing it again. This is gonna function as a light sequel to the last video. It's not essential to watch that one, but it touches on some concepts I might not explain as heavily here in regards to the actual creation process. But on that note, I do want to clarify some things from the last video. Firstly, I don't believe in realism equals better. Lethal Company itself is developed with a specific style in mind. It's why the game is rendered the way it is, and I honestly don't think these quote-unquote realistic versions would actually merge well with the game's aesthetics. It's mostly for the sake of entertainment. That being said, a lot of people have been asking for a mod. I don't actually know how to mod Lethal Company myself, but the links are all there if people want to take a crack at it. There was also a fair bit of mention for a Gary's mod player model, which has since been turned into a workshop add-on posted by Arcom, so that's there now. Secondly, I accidentally mentioned in the previous video that quads were the ideal polygon type for game engines. Quads are actually ideal for modeling, because the faces have a more consistent edge flow that makes for streamlined topology. However, in an actual game engine, quads are always split into tries, because it works more efficiently when rendering and it's less likely to result in shading issues when deforming the model. It's also why the original model I ripped of the player model was all tries. It was the in-engine version and was likely initially modeled using quads. Looking at some of the other character models in the game files, this becomes especially evident. If you don't know what I'm talking about, here's a quick summary of polygons. Either way, thanks to the people in the last video who corrected me on this. That's my bad. So, we've looked at the titular employees of the Lethal Company, but what about the things that go bump in the night? Behold the Bracken. It's one of the more alluring entities to inhabit the game, and a stressful one at that. Lose sight of it and it's liable to grab your head and break your neck. Stare at it too long and it'll charge you head on. Not to mention it has a tendency to drag your crewmates into the inky abyss should it get to them. But what actually is it? The in-game bestiary has an entry on this creature stating that its genus is entirely a mystery. Not very helpful, but we can infer some other info in here. Its skin is the color and texture of a red beetroot, and the creature's name comes from the leaves that appear to extend from the creature's spine. Bracken is a genus of ferns found all over the globe with the exception of desert and arctic environments. It can be assumed from this that the leaves protruding from the bracken's back, while probably not the specific plant found on Earth, may have a notable resemblance. These are allegedly used for intimidation, akin to a peacock, but the lore is left deliberately vague to give this beast a mysterious quality. Looking at the actual in-game model, the Bracken has a humanoid build with the exception of its legs, which feature an unguligrade structure. This is the lower limb structure of an animal. Creatures like dogs and cats have digitigrade legs, meaning they walk on their toes, while we humans have plantigrade legs, meaning we walk on the soles of our feet. Unguligrade is a fancy way of saying they walk on hooves. It's an interesting choice for what seems to be a plant-based creature, but who am I to judge? The bestiary entry states that the leaves grow from the upper spine, but looking at the actual model it seems these leaves are more so distributed along the whole vertebrae. Since the model itself is a more direct and recognized example, we'll be going with that one for its leaf distribution. As always, reference collection is the important initial step. I didn't gather too many differing references for this one, with my pure ref file containing screenshots of the Bracken in-game, anatomical reference of both human and unguligrade anatomy, and imagery of the Bracken ferns it was named after. When I began blocking out the initial shapes of the player model previously, I used subdivided cubes extruded and expanded to create the approximate shape of the character before moving on to further detailing. However, this time around we're working with a character that has much more organic shapes, and as a result I'm going to use a different approach, using something called metaballs. In computer-generated graphics, metaballs are surfaces characterized by their ability to merge into one another and create a single adjoined object. There's a lot of complex math at play with these metaballs, and I truthfully can't explain the deeper mechanics of it, but all you need to know is that they're objects capable of melting into each other in an organic way, which is useful when creating a base body for our Bracken. I'm simply able to piece these meta surfaces together to build an approximate silhouette of our creature, looking at my references to block out the major landmarks of the body as well as the shapes that make up some of the musculature. Following this, I laid out some subdivided planes along the back of the model, acting as a visual placeholder for the Bracken's leaves so I could visualize their placement going forward. As you can see, we now have a relatively simple base mesh for our model, and now we can move forward with some digital sculpting. Blender isn't ideal for this kind of process, especially at the polygon we'll be working with, so it's time to export and move over to ZBrush, the industry standard in digital sculpting software. You'll notice that I haven't made much effort with the Bracken's head, it's just an oval right now. And that's because, unlike the game's player model, I intend to do a lot of the shaping and visual development right here in ZBrush. I begin by just sculpting in the major muscle groups and trying to define the shape further, as well as marking on some creases where the leaves along the back would fit into, so I can see where their placement is without having the actual placeholder objects for the leaves visible, and obscuring my view while I work. Considering the Bracken is largely humanoid and seems to mostly align with human musculature, I'm mostly using that as my basis when sculpting this part, with some creative liberties taken where necessary. A lot of the finer details are lost in the game given its simplistic style, but I was able to notice these laid ridges along the belly of the beast, contouring up into the sides, so I thought it'd be interesting to run with this visual motif. So you'll see me including more of these ridged surfaces on the model as we go. Moving on to the head, the Bracken has a somewhat diamond-shaped skull, complete with ridges on the sides, though these are uneven and seem more akin to slices and denting in the flesh. I said the word finagle like 3 times in the last video, so I promise I'll use cooler words, but working on the head took a lot of tinkering, given the original design is essentially a near flat surface with eyes on it. Given the creature does have eyes, that means it must have eye sockets, but as they say, the eyes are the window to the soul. The Bracken is a soulless apex predator, so we've got to be careful not to humanize this thing. I sculpted some eyelids, but made sure to keep them pulled back a fair bit to prevent any restful eyes from manifesting. You see, eyelids are a key component of many for displaying emotion. So without them, creatures enter an uncanny state where you can't get a read on them, they just stare. Moving on, ZBrush gives you the option to use built-in black and white images to act as stencils for your sculpting brushes. This way you can create physical details like little bumps and cracks, and this is what I use along the surface of the model. Admittedly, this isn't loyal to the bestiary's claims of a beetroot-like texture, but I didn't quite clock this at the time and got a bit carried away. Either way, I think it looks neat. I took a quick detour back to Blender here with the exported sculpt in order to just realign our placeholder leaves. See, they don't quite line up with the slits I'd made in ZBrush for them, and moving the musculature to accommodate the leaves would kinda mess with the flow of the shapes on their back, so I just moved the leaves to accommodate the model instead. Jumping back into ZBrush, I'd realized the face of the sculpt was still carrying too much emotion. See, even more than the eyelids, the eyebrows carry all kinds of emotion, and this guy has a thick old brow. So I simply painted a mask around the eye sockets and pulled them forward, flattening out the features a bit more and killing 2 birds with 1 stone. The flatter facial structure is more loyal to the actual in-game design, and we pull off a more uncanny appearance. It's here that I'm actually pretty happy with what we've got so far, and we're ready to go back into Blender for some more technical development. As I'm sure you know, higher polygons means higher processing power required to render them, which is why we don't see games with microscopic detail. It's simply not viable, but we still want to have perceived details in our models, at least in these particular circumstances. So instead, we project these details onto a lower polygon model through the textures. But to do that, we need a lower polygonal version of our model to work with. Last time when I prepared the player model, I built the model with a non-destructive workflow, meaning I hadn't applied any modifiers and kept it fairly modular for easy adjustment as it went on. However, here we're working with an incredibly dense model that would be absolute torment to try and modify directly in Blender, so we must retopologize. In 3D, a model's topology is the way its polygons and edges are laid to make up its surface, and can vary depending on its use case. Just like I mentioned earlier, with quads and tris being preferred depending on whether you're using 3D software or importing a model into a game engine. When sculpting on a digital model, this topology is mostly disregarded in favor of making sure you get the sculpt you want, which means we have to retopologize it afterwards. According to the official Blender 4.0 manual, this is the process of simplifying a model's topology to make it cleaner and easier to work with. This is generally done by outright recreating the approximate surface of a model, and this is what we're going to do with our Bracken sculpt. It's here that I'm actually returning to the subdivided cube modeling I used to block out the player model in the last video, but this time I'm using it to form a cage around the sculpt, paired with a shrink wrap modifier that links this cage model with our sculpt. I explained this in the last video, but the shrink wrap modifier allows a mesh to be wrapped over another mesh. For Retopology, this is exceptionally useful for getting a quick result without marking out every individual polygon as we go, although we'll be doing this eventually, we can only get so far doing this. After retopologizing most of the body, I knew I had to do the head without the aid of modifiers, as there just was not enough geometry in the cage to feasibly mark out the shapes properly. The subdivision modifier mathematically smooths out and divides the polygons into smaller sections, giving the model more polygons to work with, and paired with the shrink wrap modifier, it allows for some more of the shape to come through in the retopology in less time. However, it's only now that I've applied the subdivision modifier in Blender that I have access to directly interact with the subdivided polygons, rather than working with the original cage model. Now I can retopologize the head, marking in each of the faces around its surface to create a clean retopologized surface that still holds the major shapes and silhouettes of our sculpt. Thanks to our new clean topology, marking out the seams for UV unwrapping is easier than it would have been otherwise. As a quick cliff notes from the last video, UV maps are unwrapped versions of a model projected over a 2D space, like if you unfolded origami at its seams and laid it over another piece of paper. That piece of paper is the space where a texture would be, with the unwrapped geometry, otherwise known as a UV map, being where that texture would then be projected back onto the model. With our freshly packed UV maps, we're ready to move on to Substance Painter, our texturing program of choice. Again, like ZBrush, this is a program specialized for its own purposes, in this case texture painting. The higher detail sculpt of the Bracken is exported with the suffix _high, while our retopologized mesh is exported with the suffix _low. I've already explained the concept of baking, but I wanted to give a more complete explanation this time around. Adobe's official page on the subject explains that baking is the term used to refer to the act of transferring information from a mesh into textures that Substance Painter can use for various effects. In this case, we're transferring the mesh data from our high detail sculpt into textures that affect our retopologized model. The textures generated from this baking are as follows. The normal map, which determines the angle at which light hits the model and is the primary method of simulating more details on a model with fewer polygons. The world space normal, which is like a normal map except it determines whether a surface is facing up or down. The ambient occlusion, a texture that simulates soft shadows on the model. The curvature, a texture that denotes the harshness of edges and its general surface properties. The position, which marks the top and bottom, front and back, and left and right sides of the model. It's kinda like a much more simplified normal map that covers the whole thing. And finally, the thickness texture, which shows which parts of the model are at its thickest points. The normal map is our star player when transferring the higher details onto our lower poly mesh, but these other textures also provide useful surface information when using specific features of Substance Painter, and it generally makes our workflow a lot easier in the long run. Painting onto the model itself, we work with a different set of texture types. To quickly summarize again, we have the base. This is our flat color without any lighting or effects. The metallic, this is what determines whether parts of a model are shaded like metal or not. In this case we won't be using it since there's no metal on a Bracken as far as I can tell. The roughness, this texture determines what parts are shinier and which parts have a more matte appearance. And the height. On export this will be included in the normal map textures, but while working in Substance Painter it operates as its own layer and assigns the elevation of a texture's surface. So, to start off our textures, I'm using a base of dark browns and reds and layering in more colors using the thickness maps generated during baking to create a more organic distribution of colors to achieve the beet red skin the game's bestiary talked about. While generally the baked texture set is meant to exist for smart features like dynamically generating dirt on a model, I'm just using some of our generated textures to pull more detail out of the texture itself and give it a more detailed look. Since the eyes are white glowing orbs, they won't need a lot of work here, and the hooves just have a darker texture painted in with a shinier roughness layer to simulate the shinier surface of keratin found in hair and fingernails, or in this case, hooves. Finally going back to Blender, it was time to get those leaves done. I used the game's logo as a placeholder texture while I aligned the UV maps of the leaves to use up the whole texture space, with each leaf occupying the same space in the texture. Rather than sculpting in each individual part of these leaves, I'm going to be using flat planes with textures placed over them. This is an optimized method of displaying these kinds of details that's standard in many games, and in particular, hair for game characters. In this case, it would be known as hair cards, and despite the fact we're not doing hair here, the same principle still applies. It's a texture with some transparency, and it's used on a flat surface in order to simulate finer details on a character. Lethal Company has some of these on its models. And with one final stop back in Substance Painter, I painted a leaf over the plane and used the height layer around its edges to create the illusion of thickness in the Bracken ferns. Exporting it back into Blender, it worked about as well as I'd hoped for, barring some minor adjustment in shape and UVs to get an acceptable result. We're now onto the final stretch. It's time to rig this character, and just like the player model in the last video, I used a modified Rigify skeleton to assign parts of the Bracken's mesh to specific bones with a painted-in intensity for each one. Given the lack of smaller pieces and a model with a fairly cohesive edge flow, I was actually able to achieve a fairly good result using just the automatic rigging features in Blender. That being said, I still did some manual adjustment to ensure the final result was as good as it could be, and I was honestly a little shocked that the leaves of the model auto-rig just about perfectly, given that usually pieces like this that come separate from the main model usually get lost in translation when using an auto-rigger. This was especially an issue when doing the Lethal Company player model. But after posing up the character and adjusting the lighting, we've got a finished... Well, wait a sec. Where did it go? Wait. I know I said I wasn't going to do another Lethal Company thing, but it's always fun to create stuff, and I saw people asking for it, so I figured there wasn't any reason not to go for it. After all, this gave me an opportunity to talk about some other methods of creating a model and go over some things I didn't in the last video. But to cap it off, here's a final showcase of the model for your viewing pleasure. If you stuck around for the whole process, thank you so much. If you just skipped by to see the final product, hopefully you think it's neat. Either way, I really appreciate the support from everyone, and I hope to have some eyes on whatever I do next, whenever I get to it. See you around.